Hello, this is Reindeer's Bees, and today I'm going to talk about which foundation should you choose. So as a new beekeeper, it can be very intimidating to pick equipment, setups, everything about it. There's a million options and a million opinions on what you should be doing. Newsflash, there's nothing you should be doing. There's a lot of things you can do. And so foundation is just like that, and there's a lot of choices, and I will explain the advantages and disadvantages of all of them. So there are like 5 main paths you can go with foundation and not foundation. So that would be foundationless, just wires in the frame, starter strips, wax wired foundation, and plastic foundation. So those are the 5 choices, and I'll explain about each. So no foundation, it's not super common in the US. Some people do it, but the advantages are, I don't know, some people just like the look of it, and it doesn't cost any money because you're not using any foundation, you're just buying the frame. So it is cheaper, but the reason people don't use it, the disadvantages is if you tilt the frame wrong, like if you tilt it up like this, which you can do with any of the other foundations, the comb can just fly out of the frame. And unless they bridge it to the bottom bars, which bees don't always go all the way to the bottom bars. So that's why a lot of people choose not to use foundation, because it can be risky and you can lose a lot of comb that way if you're not being careful. And even if you're being careful, it can be challenging at times. So the other reason is drone. So when bees want to make a lot more drones than beekeepers want them to. So a full mature beehive wants to make a lot of drones, and giving them foundation allows them to, or makes it till they make less drones. Since the cells on the foundation are worker size, the bees are more apt to make worker cells rather than drone cells, which are larger. And I'll put a picture up so you can see that. And the other reason is, I don't think so. The other reason is the hives can sometimes just make completely wonky comb. Since there's no foundation at all, they could just make comb going the wrong way completely. It can get really messy with foundationless. So the second type is only wires. Now I've only really seen this used by Barnyard Bees in Georgia. What he does is he just puts wires through, there's like 3 holes in the side of the frames, and he just puts wires through there, and the bees will build on those wires. So the advantages of using, wires in your frames is the comb's not going to fall out. The bees build the comb around the wires, and it stabilizes the comb in place, so you're not going to just lose comb to falling out of the frame. So that can be be very valuable. The other reason would be, honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I would assume it's cheaper than other foundations. But the disadvantages are the bees have full reign on what kind of cell they want to draw, so they will make a lot more drones if they're a bigger hive. And, there'll be less workers to make honey or make splits or whatever you may want to do. So that's one of the disadvantages. Starter strips. So starter strips are just like a little piece of wax hanging down from the frame. And they kind of give the bees a direction on how to start, but it's not a full piece of foundation and there's no wire in it. So the bees use this to, just get going. And the starter strips, what they do well is they give the bees some kind of idea of what they're supposed to do. They can still go crazy on the lower part of the frame, but it still goes decently well, I think. And then the other advantage to starter strips is it's only a small piece of wax, so it's much less expensive. So that's, ideal. And then the disadvantage is that, once again, still can make a lot of drone size cells because there's only a little bit of foundation to build off of. So wax wired foundation and plastic foundation are definitely the most common in the US by, I think, a pretty wide margin. And so I'm going to start by talking about wax wired foundation. So wax wired foundation it's a sheet of wax with, I think, typically 4 wires going through it vertically. And that keeps the wax from, the comb from falling out of the frame. So it's pretty stable. The advantages are, it's much more stable in the frame. The bees are less likely to draw drone comb because they aren't because the cells on the foundation are worker size, so they will still make some drones, but they're less likely to. So the disadvantages, if you're assembling it yourself, the wax is very sensitive at certain temperatures, so it can be very brittle when it's colder, and you can destroy your foundation while you're trying to install it. And even if you do get it in correctly, often I find that it warps a lot, and it's really warped, yeah. And so what happens is, if it's really warped on one side, then this side of the frame, there's only so much bee space for them to make comb. And so on one side of the frame, you'll just never get any brood because the comb is so deep on the other side. And so that's really why I switched off of wax foundation, is because I hated that when I'd have frames that the bees couldn't have brood on both sides. That really bothers me. I'm not sure how much it matters to other beekeepers. It probably doesn't matter that much to them, but it does to me. And so that's one of the reasons. And then the other thing is, with wax foundation, it's also really hard to see the eggs like all the other four, because they're all white. And so when the comb's just made, it's hard to see the eggs in the bottom of the cell compared to black plastic foundation. So that's one other thing. And then the bees eat through the foundation when there's a dearth on, or can. I should preface this. It has happened to me. It's not often, but sometimes they will, just eat the foundation and take it out of the frame when they're in a dearth and they're not able to draw comb, but you still have the foundation in the hive. So, that can be a pretty big pain in the butt. And then the last thing I want to talk about is swarm cells, because when the bees have wax foundation, they can kind of chew where they want to, and whereas they can't with plastic. And so this often allows them to put swarm cells higher on the frames, which makes them harder to see. And so you're more likely to miss a swarm cell and then have a swarm leave, which would be quite unfortunate. So plastic foundation, this is what I used. I started trying it out, I think mid-summer of 2019. Was my second or third year, yeah. I think it was, my second season. And why I switched, so I saw a bunch of beekeepers on YouTube doing it, which is probably not great reason to do something, but I wanted to try it because obviously it worked, and the people at my bee class, they just said it doesn't work at all ever, which I felt like was true at the time because I didn't know any better. So the advantages to plastic foundation are, it doesn't ever fall out of the frame, or most of the time. Like, the comb is not able to fall out of the frame. Sometimes the plastic can get a little bent out of the frame, but that's really unusual. It's only happened to me like once or twice. And so it's just much more stable surface. They can't chew holes around the top, and with the plastic frames, you're guaranteed to have brood on both sides once they draw it out, because it's perfectly straight in the middle of the frame. And so the comb isn't a lot deeper on one side than the other, which really bothers me if it's not that way. So that's one of the main reasons I switched. Then the other thing about plastic is it never blows out in an extractor. If you have wax wired foundation, on occasion, if you have an unbalanced load or like unbalanced frame, sometimes the whole comb will just get right out of the frame. So that can be a pretty annoying thing when you're extracting. It hasn't happened to me personally, but I've heard many stories about it. So that's another thing about plastic foundation. It doesn't blow out in an extractor. And then if you get black plastic foundation, it's very easy to see eggs as soon as they draw it out. With other foundations and yellow plastic foundation, as soon as the bees draw it out, it's pretty hard to see the eggs. I can still do it, but some people can't. And so with black plastic, as soon as they draw it out, you're still able to really see the eggs. The white eggs really contrast well on the black foundation. So that's really ideal about it. And then it's like wax foundation in the sense that if you have it on during a dearth time of the year where they're not bringing in food and not drawing comb, then they can pick the wax off of your plastic foundation. And so then the next spring, when it's time to draw comb again, they're not going to be willing to do it, or they'll draw it all wonky off the foundation. And so that can be really frustrating. If you leave it in the sun for too long, it can melt off of the foundation. So you want to be careful. You always want to have the frames in the shade if you're pulling them out of the hive to inspect. Undrawn frames, you want to make sure that they're in the shade. Then the last thing about plastic foundation is sometimes the bees will just draw wonky comb on it, but it works pretty well if you just scrape that comb off. Not like, don't scrape the foundation really hard because that'll take the wax coating off, but just kind of chisel it off almost. And then let the bees restart it. And it might take a few times, but you're not losing that much wax and they will draw it out right. So, you know, that frame could be in your hive 10 more years. It's worth the effort to make them draw it out right the first time, or make it draw it out right, you know, forever, because you're gonna have that frame probably for a long time. So that's why I like it. I've only used plastic foundation since 2019. In 2020, I changed out like over 100 frames of wax foundation that hadn't been drawn yet into plastic because I just didn't want to deal with all of it. Most of it was really warped. I don't know if that was my seller's fault, what it was, but it was all warped, and I was very careful not to warp it while I was doing it. So I don't really think it was user error, though maybe it was. So that's why I like plastic, and it's definitely different, and a lot of beekeepers disagree with it, but there's nothing wrong with using plastic as long as it has a really good wax coat on it. The bees are going to draw it out well, just like any wax foundation or any other foundation. So that's what you need to think about with wax foundation. Comment down below, subscribe if you're interested in more educational videos just like this. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Reindeers Bees, and I will see you in the next one.